What's up guys, I'm Lizzie. Would you be able to tell if your horse had dysfunction in their hoof before it was causing them a problem? Do you know what a balanced, well-functioning hoof looks like, and would you be able to know if your horse had one? Well, today we're gonna go over how to read your horse's hoof. This is part 2. In part 1, we went over the entire anatomy of the hoof. Then we looked at the side profile of the hoof from the outside, and we learned how to read the grid of the hoof. Plus, we went over a bunch of common hoof dysfunctions that a lot of domestic horses deal with. So if that's something you're not familiar with, you might want to go check out the first part of this series. But today, we're going to look at the back and the front of the hoof and common dysfunctions that you can see and read from those angles. Plus, we'll go over the coronary band and what it's telling us on the outside about what's happening on the inside of the hoof so that we can stop these things in its tracks and fix them before it's too late. Looking at the back of the hoof is a great way to tell how well the hoof is functioning and how well it's supporting your horse. So I've drawn up a couple different examples here that are very common. This one is our ideal hoof. As you can see, this is our hairline. This is the frog. These are our heels. And these are the heel bulbs. So as you can see with this high functioning hoof, that the heels are just barely longer than the frog. And your frog is nice and open and wide, which means that it's highly functioning and doing its job well. The heel bulbs are nice and evenly sized with each other and aligned with our frog. Our hairline is nice and even on both sides, which is an indicator that you have good balance going on. Now let's take a look at this one, which as you can tell right away looks a lot different than this one. This is a really common hoof that you'll see on a shod horse. Now it's also very common in barefoot horses too, when your trimmer does not understand the principle of needing to engage the frog. So as you can see, our heels are way too long, which then causes the frog to not be able to engage with the ground. And when your heels get too long, they start to close in on themselves this way. So they're pinching the frog closed and up, which is jamming them up. And as you can see what happens to the heel bulbs, they tend to get jammed up and pinched together, and they're losing their function and their ability to do their job well. And also the hairline looks very different in this one compared to this one. Because of the heels being so long, it jams up into the hairline and it creates this arch. And then because of the heel bulbs being jammed together, it causes this drop right here. So if you look at the back of your horse's hoof and they have this really pointy dropped hairline like this, that's an indicator that your hoof has dysfunction. Another thing that'll happen when you have long jammed up heels is that it'll jam up the hairline right here. So it'll look like the coronary band now has a shelf that it's sitting on. Instead of being this smooth transition from hair to hoof, we have a jammed up situation right here because the hooves are literally pushing up against the hairline, causing it to point up. So in this scenario, your hoof wall is going to be taking all of the impact on the ground. When we look at this hoof, we can see that the weight is shared between the hoof wall and the frog and the sole underneath. It's all being evenly dispersed like it's supposed to be. In this hoof, all of the weight is being bared on the hoof wall. This frog is not being engaged at all, which means that the horse has lost a lot of its function. And this is also going to create a really sensitive hoof because a frog that is not engaged gets weak and sensitive. So a lot of people will say that they've tried going barefoot with their horse, but their horse is immediately lame and uncomfortable. It's because they have issues up in the frog. The frog is painful, and when they can't put pressure on the frog, it makes it look like they're lame because they have to walk on their toes then. Obviously that's not good. But the frog won't engage and won't grow and won't strengthen if it never is able to be activated. The horse will always be uncomfortable and look lame when their frog is dead and weak like this. Now let's go on to our third scenario, which is complete imbalance. You might already be able to see that there's a lot of dysfunction going on with this hoof, but I've seen this hoof enough times to be able to say that it's very common. So let's break this hoof down and talk about where the dysfunction is. Right away, we have flaring on this side. We have a high heel on this side. We have a pitched up frog on this side, but because this side is flaring, the frog drops down on this side to meet this heel. As you can see, we have very imbalanced heels already. This one is jammed up a lot higher than this one is, which then causes the heel bulbs to be unaligned. This heel bulb is a lot higher and more jammed up than this heel bulb is. This side of the heel is much more jammed up, just like it is up here. But this one is more dropped down like it is over here. So our heel bulbs are not level. Our coronary band is not level. Our hairline is very unlevel and uneven. We have it jammed up on this side because our heels are being jammed up on this side, but it's dropped on this side because it is dropping on this side. So why is this happening? Why is this heel side flaring and this side just growing higher? Why is there uneven contact with the frog to the ground? And basically the answer is because this heel is way too high. Normally when you have a horse with a flaring hoof wall or a cracking hoof wall, we attack the flare and we attack the cracks because we think that's where the problem is. When in reality, we need to look at the opposite side of that hoof. Instead of chopping off this flare and hoping that that'll fix it, we have to look at this side of the heel. This side of the heel is causing this flare. So by chopping this flare, it's only going to continue to flare through its next growth. This heel right here is causing this side to flare because it's so uneven. This horse's hoof is being jammed up on this side, so it's putting all of its weight on this hoof wall, which is going to cause the hoof wall to give away and flare and crack. So instead of attacking the flare, we need to take down this heel right here so that we can bring it back down to level. You'll also notice in this kind of hoof that you'll have much more concavity in the sole right in this area than you do on this side. This side will be a lot more flat and have less concavity, and the frog will be kind of jammed up on this side of the hoof because the horse is basically walking on the side of their hoof and putting all of their weight on this side of their hoof and none on this side because this side is jamming them up. So the more this side grows, the more this side will flare. The more you take off of this flare, the more it'll tip on its flare, which will then cause the flare to get worse and worse. I had a mild case of this going on with Stella and I didn't know why. I thought it was just because I was leaving too much time in between my trimmings so that her hooves were just getting long and it would cause them to flare. Although letting your hoof get long is not ideal, it should not be causing massive flares. So when I learned more about looking at the back of the hoof and being able to read the heel bulbs, I noticed that she had one that was dropped way lower and the other one was much higher and less engaged. This heel bulb was a lot more engaged because this side of the frog was being engaged. But this heel bulb came up a lot higher like this one because this side of the frog was not being engaged. And so as soon as I saw that divergence, I realized that this flare was not the problem, but this side of the hoof was the problem. So after a few frequent trims with Stella, I've brought this heel down and I've seen this heel bulb drop down lower and have both sides of the hoof get properly engaged and bear the weight evenly so that both sides of the frogs can grow evenly. Now this perspective is what the front of this hoof looks like when you have a jammed up heel on one side and a flare on the other side. This can also happen when both of your heels are too long. It'll cause the front of the hoof to flare and crack. The hoof wall is not designed to bear all of the horse's weight. So when it's asked to do so, it'll flare and it'll crack. So when the horse has high heels and it's putting a lot of weight on its toe, that'll cause the hoof wall to flare out and or crack. That's why it's super important to get this level of balanced in your hoof so that the weight is being distributed evenly throughout the hoof wall, the frog, the sole, so that everything can support the horse like it's supposed to. It's not just there for looks. It's supposed to be functioning like this and not just dead and unfunctioning like this. So again, when we have a super high heel on this side and it's jamming up our heel right here, it's going to be forcing all of the horse's weight onto the other side of the hoof. So it's going to flare that side of the hoof because that hoof wall is not designed to support all of the horse's weight on that side. And we can see this is happening just by the coronary band and how it drops on one side and it's jammed up on the other side. So just by looking at the coronary band, we can see that the horse is not distributing its weight evenly side to side. So go pick up your horse's hoof and look at it from this angle. How even are your hoof bulbs? Do they look nice and strong like this one? Or are they jammed up and weak like this one? Look at your coronary band. Is it nice and even and level like this one? Or is it jammed up on the sides and dropped in the center? How level are your heels and how high are your heels? Does your frog look like it's high functioning and able to take impact? Or does it look weak and thrushy like this one? These are really important things to look at and to look for in your horse's hoof. And if you see any of these dysfunctions in your horse's hoof, it's really important that they're addressed immediately. Now let's move on to page number 2. In my last video, we talked about the grid of the hoof. And I mentioned that the grid will give you a lot of information about what's happening on the inside. So what do I mean about that? Now, David Landerville is one of my biggest inspirations when it comes to hoof care. He has been a trimmer for a very long time and he has rehabbed a lot of horses. And one of the things he stands by is that you don't need x-rays to be able to tell what's going on the inside of the hoof. If you know how to read the hoof properly and you know how to read the grid, you can tell exactly what's going on the inside of the hoof just by reading the outside of the hoof. So if you can read the grid and if you can read the coronary band, you can see what's going on the inside of the hoof without x-rays. It's actually very visible what's going on the inside of the hoof just by looking at the outside. Now this is our well-balanced, high-functioning hoof. We have a very nice coronary band, we have a very nice heel height, we have very even horn tubules that go parallel all the way down to the heel. From the dorsal wall, we have a nice rocker in our quarters that allows the hoof to expand with impact. Then we have the growth rings that grow this way, all the way down from the coronary band to the ground. So this is your ideal hoof. And in your ideal hoof, you have your coffin bone, which sits parallel to ground level. Now let's take a look at our second example. Immediately notice this coronary band, how it drops at the dorsal wall and gets jammed up at the heel and then drops under itself. So let's immediately compare to our ideal hoof, where the coronary band is nice and even. As we can see, there's immediate dysfunction and distortion in this hoof, just by looking at this coronary band and how it drops at the dorsal wall and gets jammed up at the heel and drops under itself at the back of the heel. Now what is this right here telling us about what's happening on the inside? It's telling us that the coffin bone is tipping forward, because the coronary band will always follow the coffin bone. And if you were to read this horse's grid, you would see that the growth rings are following the coronary band. So they're dropping at the dorsal wall and being jammed up at the heel, just like the coronary band. And if you were going to read the horn tubules, you would see that they would start off parallel with the dorsal wall, but the closer you get to the heel, they get jammed up underneath themselves due to a high underrun heel. So in last week's video, we talked about high underrun heels and how it jams the horse's hoof up so that it makes them walk on their toe. But you can also see that when you have a high underrun heel, it's going to jam up the inside of the hoof and cause it to tilt forward as well. That's what causes this jam up here and the drop right here. The more the heel gets jammed up right here, the more weight the horse will put on their toe down here, which then causes the coronary band to drop right here and causes the heel to get jammed up right here. And as you can see, the coffin bone will follow. Now let's move on to our last example where we deal with a bull-nosed hoof. Now immediately notice the position of the coronary band. This hoof is moving in the opposite direction that this hoof is moving. Notice that the coronary band on this one is nearly horizontal with the ground level, and this coronary band is nearly parallel with the ground level. And in our ideal hoof, our coronary band is neither parallel or horizontal with the ground. There is a nice sloping angle on it, like they're supposed to be. Now let's go back to this very distorted hoof. Again, the coffin bone stays in line with the coronary band. So when your coronary band is being jammed up and going basically horizontal with ground level, your coffin bone is going to follow. And the reason the dorsal wall gets bull-nosed is because the coffin bone is jamming into it and pushing it out. So I think anybody, even with an untrained eye, could see that there's something very wrong going on with this hoof. But it's poor trimming mechanics to put it there in the first place, and it's trimming mechanics that could bring it back. So just because a horse has a really ugly looking hoof like this does not mean that they're doomed for the rest of their life to live with this kind of dysfunction. Another thing I want to quickly point out here is how your hoof angles affects the rest of the horse's leg and suspension mechanisms. If you have a hoof with a really high heel and a really short toe, the horse's leg angle, their fetlock joint, is going to be putting a lot more force directly on top of the hoof. When we look at this hoof and we have our ideal angles going on, the leg and the fetlock joint have room to drop below the hoof so that it can have that suspension. When it's being pitched up directly above the hoof, it's now dropping directly on top of the hoof. So the hoof is taking the entire impact instead of the leg being able to absorb some of it behind the hoof. But when you have it really drastic in this situation, all of the weight is being dropped in the fetlock instead of it being absorbed in through the hoof. So this is also not evenly distributing the weight. The horse is dropping most of its weight in its fetlock instead of it being absorbed through the hoof. Here it's being absorbed entirely through the hoof and not at all through the fetlock joints or the rest of the leg. But here, when we have our ideal angles, you get it distributed through the hoof and through the fetlock joints and through the rest of the horse's joints. So no singular point of the hoof and the leg is absorbing 100% of the impact. When you have imbalance like this and this, the horse is then straining and forcing a ton of weight and impact on one particular part of their body instead of being able to spread it out evenly through their joints and through their feet. The hoof is the horse's entire foundation, and it's super important that that is high functioning. And it should be high priority. If you sacrifice your horse's ability to completely rehab or recover because you want to get back to riding, then you are not prioritizing your horse. If your horse is going lame and dealing with hoof issues, and you then put shoes on them so that you can go back to riding, that is not fixing the problem. They are not comfortable. They are not ready to be ridden at that point. They are still dealing with issues. It just looks like they can move okay now, so then it's okay to ride them, which is not the case at all. If your horse is lame with hoof dysfunctions, they need time to recover. They need proper treatment. They need constant care. There is no quick fixes for that. It's super important that they get frequent trims. If you trim your horse's hooves frequently enough, you won't even have to take a nippers to their hooves ever, because a rasp will suffice. It's a lot easier to deal with the hoof when you deal with it frequently because there's not big changes you have to make. When a hoof is under your care, there should never be a time where the hoof looks bad because you haven't trimmed it in a while. If a hoof is looking bad because you haven't trimmed it in a while, that means it's growing dysfunctions, which dysfunctions can't be fixed in one trim. So if you trim once and then don't trim again for a long time, those dysfunctions are just going to continue to get worse. So in order to fix dysfunctions, they have to be addressed super frequently. Depending on the state of the hoof, a trim every 1 to 3 weeks should be done. If you're just doing maintenance trimming on an already balanced hoof, 3 to 4 weeks is more acceptable. The goal is to basically simulate wear on your horse's hoof, as if they were putting on a ton of miles every day like the wild horse does. The average wild horse will travel up to 20 plus miles a day, which is enough wear to keep the hoof well balanced. So that's kind of the goal with our domestic horses. Obviously we can't make them walk 20 miles every single day on hard surfaces to simulate that wear, so we have to do that mechanically with our rasp. It's really important that it's done frequently because the new hoof growth will follow how the old hoof was trimmed and managed. So if your horse's hoof always just grows wonky feet, it's because they're always trimmed a little wonky. Or if they grow wonky feet, it's just because there's too much time in between trims that the hoof has time to distort itself. It's really important to stay on top of the trims so the hoof never has time to distort and cause dysfunctions. But that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you did, let me know down in the comments. I post some videos every single Sunday. You can go follow me on Instagram and TikTok at sport.pony13, and I will see you guys next week Sunday. Bye!